Some losses are like a canyon carved into your soul. They cut so deep they reshape your entire world, leaving you to carry a weight that was always meant for two. Every single sunrise becomes a choice between giving up and giving in, or finding the strength to fight for one more day, for whatever scraps of hope remain. Catherine Bell knew this weight better than anyone. For 2 long years, this young widow had been fighting to save her late husband's wheat farm, fighting to raise 2 small children all on her own. This land, this sprawling ocean of gold under the vast Wyoming sky, was all she had left of the man she'd lost. It was the last piece of a love that had been stolen from her far too soon. Then one morning, everything changed. A stranger appeared at her door, a giant of a man with worn-out boots and hands that looked like they were carved from old oak. He didn't ask for money, he didn't make promises. All he asked for was a chance to work, just honest labor in exchange for a roof over his head and a plate of food at her table. He only said 5 words, 5 simple words that would ignite a firestorm and change her life forever. What Catherine didn't know was that this quiet, hulking man was carrying secrets as deep and as heavy as her own grief, and that sometimes the greatest love doesn't come from fancy words or grand promises. It comes from someone who just keeps showing up, day after day, ready to face the storm by your side. This is a story about a woman who had learned to trust no one but herself, and a man who spoke not with his mouth, but with his hands. Can a heart shattered by loss ever learn to beat again? Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if this one touches your heart, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because the story I have for you tomorrow, well, let's just say you don't want to miss it. The first hint of dawn was bleeding across the Wyoming horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, but Catherine Bell had been awake for hours. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. It came in short, jagged bursts, always broken by the never-ending list of chores that screamed for her attention. She stood at the kitchen window, her fingers wrapped tight around a chipped mug. Thomas's mug. The coffee was thin and weak. She'd been stretching the same grounds for 3 days. But it was warm, and right now, warmth was enough. Outside, the wheat field stretched out like a golden sea. It was a beautiful sight, but Catherine's eyes saw what others wouldn't. The stalks were too thin. The heads of wheat weren't as full as they should be. 2 years. 2 years of fighting this land alone had taught her to read its secrets, to hear its whispers of drought and decay. The farm had thrived under her husband Thomas's hands. Now, it just showed the scars of her struggle. Fences sagged. The tractor coughed and sputtered, needing repairs she couldn't afford. The very soil seemed tired, yearning for the kind of attention she just couldn't give while trying to raise 2 young children. A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned to see 8-year-old Samuel, his dark hair a mess from sleep. He had his father's eyes, deep brown and filled with a seriousness that was too old for his small face. When he looked at her with that worried expression, her heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. It was a painful cocktail of love and grief. "Morning, Mama," he said, his voice quiet. "You're up early." "Always lots to do, sweetheart," she replied, forcing a smile. It was a lie, and they both knew it. She was up early every single day. She poured him a glass of milk. At least their cow Bessie was still producing. It was one of the few things that was still working right. "Where's your sister?" she asked. "Still sleeping," Samuel mumbled, picking at a loose thread on the tablecloth. She was talking in her sleep again, about Papa. Catherine's throat tightened. Mary was only 4 when Thomas died. Her memories of her father were like fairy tales, faded and magical. In her dreams, he was still there, strong and smiling, ready to lift her onto his shoulders and show her the world from high above. The truth was a much harsher story. 2 summers ago, a sudden thunderstorm had spooked his horse. Thomas had been thrown, his head hitting a rock. By the time Catherine found him, The rain had already washed the life from his eyes, leaving her alone with 2 children and a mountain of debt. She moved to the stove and started making breakfast. Johnny cakes and a few strips of bacon, the last of it. Their supplies were dwindling, but there was enough for today. There always had to be enough for today. "Mama?" Samuel's voice was careful. It was the voice he used when he had something heavy on his mind. "Mr. Larson came by yesterday, when you were in the fields. Henrik Larson owned the farm next door. He was a widower, and his offers to help had been getting more and more personal." "I know what he wants, Sam," she said softly. He said he was worried about you, about us." Samuel stared down at his plate. "Mrs. Patterson at the store said the same thing. She said a woman can't run a farm like this alone. She said we should sell." He looked up, and the fear in his eyes was a dagger in her heart. "Are we going to lose Papa's farm, Mama?" The question hit her like a physical blow, but she held his gaze, her face a mask of calm. She had to be strong for him. "No, sweetheart, we are not. This is our home. Your Papa built this place for us, and we are not giving up." But even as she said the words, she could feel the weight of them. The truth was, she was failing. Every night she'd take down Thomas's old farming journal. The pages were filled with his strong, steady handwriting, notes about crop rotations, weather patterns, his dreams for the future. Reading it was like having a conversation with a ghost. It was her only comfort, but it was also a constant, painful reminder of how much she was falling short. A small voice called from upstairs. "Mama?" It was Mary. Catherine stood up, but Samuel grabbed her hand. "Mama, when Papa was alive, did you ever worry? Did you ever think, what if?" Her heart ached for him. An 8-year-old boy shouldn't have to carry the world on his shoulders. "We thought we had more time," she whispered, the truth tasting like ash in her mouth. They had been young and in love, and death was a distant shadow, something for old people to worry about. Now, that shadow lived in her house. The bank owned a piece of this farm, and Mr. Wade, the banker, was starting to make visits that felt less like friendly check-ins and more like warnings. "Mama!" Mary's call was more insistent now. "Coming, sweetie!" Catherine called back. She looked at Samuel. "Finish your breakfast, and Sam, we're going to be fine, I promise." She climbed the stairs and found Mary sitting up in bed, her dark curls a tangled mess. "I had the dream again, Mama," Mary announced. "Papa was teaching me how to braid a horse's mane." Catherine sat on the bed, her fingers gently working through the knots in her daughter's hair. "That sounds like a lovely dream." "It was," Mary said, her voice suddenly small. "But then I woke up, and he's not here." She looked at Catherine, her green eyes wide and serious. "Mama, why can't people stay forever?" It was a question with no answer, a question that adults spent their whole lives trying to forget. "I don't know, sweetheart," Catherine said, her voice thick. "But I think Papa is still here, in the work we do, in the love we have for this land." Mary seemed to consider this. "It's not the same," she finally said. "No," Catherine agreed, her heart breaking a little more. "It's not the same." After breakfast, she sent the children out to play and face the day. Milking Bessie, collecting eggs, checking the pigs. The routine was the only thing that kept her sane. Today's problem was the water pump near the barn. It had been groaning for a week, and now it was only spitting out a pathetic trickle. Without it, the livestock would go thirsty. She knelt in the dirt, her hands covered in grease, trying to remember what Thomas had done the last time it broke. The sun was getting higher, and sweat was already trickling down her back. It was another problem on a mountain of problems, another sign that she was losing this battle. And that's when she heard the voice. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice was deep and quiet. It came from right behind her. Catherine spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. A man stood there, a giant of a man. He was taller than Thomas, with shoulders as wide as a barn door and hands that looked like they could wrestle a bear. His clothes were worn from travel, but they were clean. His eyes were the color of a stormy sky, and he held his hat in his hands, perfectly still, as if he could wait forever. "Can I help you?" she asked, getting to her feet, suddenly aware of the dirt on her face and the grease on her dress. "Looking for work, ma'am," the stranger said. His voice was calm, but there was an accent she couldn't quite place. "Saw your fields from the road. Looks like you could use an extra pair of hands." Her guard went up instantly. She'd dealt with drifters before. They always wanted more than she could give. "I appreciate the offer," she said, her voice firm, "but I can't pay wages." The man just nodded, as if he expected it. "Wasn't asking for wages, ma'am. Just a place to sleep and a few meals. The barn would be fine." This was new. She studied his face, searching for a hint of a lie, a flicker of deception. She found nothing but a quiet sincerity that was deeply unsettling. Who was this man? "What kind of work can you do?" she asked, testing him. "Whatever needs doing," he replied. "Crops, livestock, repairs. I know my way around a farm." She glanced toward the house. Samuel and Mary had stopped playing and were staring at the stranger, their curiosity a palpable thing. The practical part of her brain was screaming. The pump, the fences, the leaking barn roof, the endless list of jobs she couldn't do alone. But the other part of her, the part that had learned to be suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true, was whispering a warning. A woman alone with 2 children was a target. Trust was a currency she didn't have. "I don't even know your name," she said. "Elias Thorne, ma'am." He shifted his weight, and she noticed for the first time that he had a slight limp. "I don't talk much, but I work hard." There was something about the simple, unadorned statement that struck a chord deep inside her. She thought about Thomas's journal, about all the dreams slowly turning to dust. She thought about her children's worried faces. "I have 2 children," she said, another test. "Yes, ma'am. I can see that," he said, his gaze softening as he looked toward the house. "And they always come first, as they should." She found herself staring at his hands again. They were calloused and scarred, but they were clean. There was a stillness about him, a solid presence that felt safe. It was a feeling she hadn't had in a very long time. "Why?" she asked suddenly. The question hung in the air between them. "Why would you work for nothing but room and board? What's in it for you?" Elias Thorne was quiet for a long moment. His stormy eyes looked past her, out at the fields of wheat shimmering in the sun. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft, she had to lean in to hear it. "Sometimes, ma'am," he said, his voice laced with a sadness she knew all too well, "a man just needs a place to belong." The words hit her like a physical blow. A place to belong. It was the very thing she was fighting so hard to keep. It was a language her grieving heart understood. Against all her better judgment, against every warning bell screaming in her head, she heard herself say the words. "All right. You can stay in the barn. We'll see how it works out." A flicker of something, relief maybe, crossed his face. "Thank you, ma'am. You won't regret it." As she watched him walk toward the barn, his stride long and steady despite the limp, she twisted the simple gold wedding band on her finger. She didn't know if she'd just made the best decision of her life or the biggest mistake. But for the first time in 2 years, as the sun climbed higher in the Wyoming sky, she didn't feel completely and utterly alone. And that had to count for something. True to his word, Elias Thorne was waiting on her porch before the sun was even up. The sky was just starting to blush pink, and he stood there, hat in hand, with that same unnerving patience. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Where do you want me to start?" Catherine had tossed and turned all night, her mind racing with 1,000 worst-case scenarios. But seeing him now, so respectful and ready to work, some of that anxiety began to fade. "The water pump," she said, leading him across the dew-soaked yard. "It's about to give up completely." She explained the problem, the strange noises, her failed attempts to fix it. Elias listened without a word, his stormy eyes focused on the mechanism. He knelt beside it, and his hands, large as they were, moved with a surprising delicacy. He touched the fittings, felt for vibrations, listened to the machine's dying gasps. It was like watching a doctor examine a patient. "Here's your trouble," he said after a few minutes, pointing to a cracked housing she'd completely missed. "Losing pressure. Simple fix." And then, the strangest thing happened. He opened a worn leather satchel she hadn't noticed before, and inside was a set of tools. Not just any tools. These were high-quality, well-maintained instruments. The tools of a master craftsman. "You came prepared," she observed, her curiosity piqued. "A man on the road learns to be," he replied, not looking up from his work. He moved with a swift, startling efficiency. Within the hour, the pump was working better than it had in years, the water flowing strong and steady. She was speechless. That repair would have cost her a month's earnings in town. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "Glad to help, ma'am." Just then, the sound of her children's voices drifted from the house. They were awake. "Would you like some breakfast?" she asked, feeling it was the least she could offer. "I'd be grateful for anything you can spare," he said. In the kitchen, Samuel and Mary eyed the stranger with wide, curious eyes. "Children, this is Mr. Thorne," Catherine said. "He's going to be helping around the farm." Samuel, ever the serious one, looked Elias up and down. "You're the man who fixed the pump." "That's right," Elias replied, his voice gentle. "You must be Samuel. Your mother tells me you're a big help around here." The boy puffed out his chest with pride. "I can milk Bessie and stack firewood. Those are important jobs," Elias said with a gravity that made Samuel beam. "Takes a responsible man to handle work like that." Mary, who was usually shy, leaned forward. "Are you going to stay?" "That's up to your mama," Elias said, his gaze meeting Catherine's. "But I'd like to, if she'll have me." "Good," Mary declared. "Mama works too hard." Elias actually smiled, the first real smile she'd seen. It transformed his rugged face, making him look younger, less burdened. "Your daughter sees things clearly," he said to Catherine. As she made breakfast, she watched him with her children. He didn't talk down to them. He answered their endless questions with a patience that was astonishing. When Samuel asked about his tools, Elias explained what each one was for. When Mary asked if he'd ever seen a real eagle, he described one he'd seen in Colorado with such vivid detail that Catherine could almost see it herself. But something he said stuck with her. Mary asked if the eagle had talked to him. "No," Elias had replied, his voice serious. "But it told me things. The way it soared told me about the wind. The way it hunted told me where the fish were. Sometimes, you can learn a lot just by watching, without any words at all." Catherine felt a chill. There was more to this man than met the eye. A lot more. After breakfast, he didn't wait to be told what to do. He moved through the farm with a quiet purpose that was breathtaking. He fixed the sagging barn door. He mended a broken fence line. He even sharpened her garden tools until they were like new. He worked with a focused intensity she hadn't seen since Thomas. But it was what happened with the horses that truly stunned her. Her two horses, Thunder and Belle, had been skittish and nervous ever since Thomas's accident. They shied away from everyone. But when Elias approached the corral, they didn't spook. They watched him, their ears perked. Thunder, the more nervous of the two, actually walked toward him. Elias held out a hand, and the horse nudged it gently. It was a gesture of trust Catherine hadn't seen in 2 years. "He has a way with them," she whispered to herself, watching from the kitchen window. Thomas had always said you can judge a man by how animals react to him. What was it about this man, this quiet, mysterious drifter? Her thoughts were shattered by the sound of another horse riding into the yard. It was Henrik Larsson. Her heart sank. This was the last thing she needed. Henrik's face was a thundercloud as he saw Elias working near the barn. "Catherine!" he boomed, dismounting. "I came to check on you." His eyes were locked on Elias. "Who's the stranger?" His name is Elias Thorne, she said, trying to keep her voice even. He's helping with some repairs. A drifter? Henrik scoffed, stepping closer. He lowered his voice, but not enough. Catherine, you can't be serious. A woman alone, with 2 children, taking in a man you know nothing about? He could be dangerous. He's been nothing but a gentleman, she said, her temper starting to rise. They all are at first, Henrik insisted. His presence felt suffocating. You need someone you can trust, someone with roots here, someone like me. The implication hung heavy in the air. Catherine felt trapped. The security Henrik offered was real. He was a known quantity, but the price was her independence. I can make my own decisions, Henrik. Can you? His gaze flickered to Elias again. What do you really know about him? Where did he come from? Why is he really here? The questions were the same ones she'd been asking herself, but hearing them from Henrik, laced with suspicion and jealousy, made her defensive. Elias had done nothing but good since he arrived. He had proven himself with his actions. Before she could answer, Elias was walking toward them. He moved with that same unsettling calm, his eyes taking in the entire scene. Excuse me, ma'am, he said, his voice quiet but firm, addressing only her. I finished the fence. Is there anything else you need before dark? It was a brilliant move. He was acknowledging her authority, placing her firmly in charge, while subtly reminding Henrik that he was just a hired hand following orders. Henrik, however, was not impressed. He turned on Elias. Hold on there. I don't believe we've been introduced. Elias Thorne, Elias said, his voice even. Henrik Larsson. I own the land to the east, Henrik said, puffing out his chest. What brings you to Wyoming? Looking for work. There's plenty of work in town for an able-bodied man, Henrik sneered. No need to impose on a widow. The insult was sharp, but Elias didn't even flinch. Mrs. Bell offered me work, Mr. Larsson. I didn't impose. Henrik's face turned red. He turned back to Catherine. You offered him work? A complete stranger? That doesn't sound like you, Catherine. It sounds foolish. That was it. The dam of her patience broke. What's foolish, Henrik? She said, her voice shaking with a fury that surprised even her. Is judging a man before you know him. What's foolish is thinking a woman can't make her own choices. Mr. Thorne has done more work in one day than most men do in a week, and he has treated me and my children with more respect than you are showing me right now. The 3 of them stood in a tense, vibrating silence. Then Elias did something completely unexpected. He looked at Henrik, and his expression wasn't angry. It was understanding. Mr. Larsson, he said, his voice calm and reasonable. You're right to be cautious. A man who looks out for his neighbors is a good man to have around, but Mrs. Bell is more than capable of managing her own affairs. He paused, and his eyes met Catherine's. And I've given her my word that I'll cause no trouble. My word is all I have, but I keep it. Henrik was speechless. He'd come looking for a fight, a confrontation. Instead, he'd been met with a quiet dignity he didn't know how to handle. He mumbled something about needing to check his own fences, mounted his horse, and rode away, defeated. Catherine stared at Elias, her mind reeling. His response had been masterful. It was the move of a diplomat or a general, not a simple farmhand. I'm sorry about that, she said, feeling drained. No need to be, Elias said, his gaze following Henrik down the road. A man protecting what he values. I understand that more than you know. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Catherine felt a profound shift inside her. The mystery of Elias Thorne had only deepened. Who was this man who could calm a spooked horse with a touch, fix any machine with expert hands, and dismantle a man's anger with a few quiet words? He wasn't just a drifter, he was something else entirely. And for the first time, she wasn't just curious. She was afraid, not of him, but of the secrets he was hiding. A week passed, and the farm transformed. Under Elias's steady hand, the place began to breathe again. Fences were mended, the barn roof was patched, and the fields looked healthier than they had in years. He worked from sunup to sundown, a silent, tireless force of nature. And the children, they blossomed under his attention. It was Samuel who showed her the horse. "Mama, look! Look what Mr. Thorne made me!" He burst into the kitchen, his eyes shining. In his small hand was a wooden horse. But it wasn't just a toy, it was a masterpiece. Carved from a single piece of scrap wood, every line was perfect. The muscles seemed to ripple under the smooth surface. The mane flowed as if caught in an invisible wind. It was the work of a true artist. "He said he made it in the evenings," Samuel said, his voice filled with awe. "He showed me how a real horse runs. He knows everything, Mama." Catherine's throat was tight. This wasn't just a gift. It was a message, a gesture of kindness so profound it left her breathless. Then Mary ran in, her face flushed with excitement. "Mama, Mr. Eli helped me catch a butterfly, but he said we had to let it go. He said it had important work to do." "Mr. Eli?" Catherine asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's what he told me to call him," Mary said happily. "He said Mr. Thorne was too formal for friends." Her children had completely and utterly accepted this stranger into their lives. They trusted him. They looked up to him. He was becoming a part of their family, and that terrified her, because she still knew nothing about him. Later that day, she saw him working by the creek, reinforcing a weak section of fence. He'd taken his shirt off in the afternoon heat. She stopped, hidden by the trees, and her blood ran cold. His back was a road map of old scars. These weren't farm accidents. One was a puckered, ugly scar that looked like an old bullet wound. Another was a long, thin, white line that could only have come from a knife. This man had seen violence. He had seen battle. Her heart hammered in her chest. Who was he? An outlaw? A runaway soldier? She stepped out from the trees, trying to keep her voice steady. "Elias." He turned, and for a split second she saw something in his eyes, a flash of a different man, a harder man. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual calm. He quickly pulled his shirt on. "Mrs. Bell," he said, "I didn't hear you." "The children," she started, deciding not to mention the scars. "They're growing very attached to you." He stopped his work, his expression serious. "I know. If you want me to keep my distance." "No," she said, faster than she intended. "That's not it. It's just, I don't want them to be hurt when you leave." Elias looked at her, and his stormy eyes were filled with a deep, aching sadness. "Truth is, Mrs. Bell, I don't want to leave. This place, your family, it feels like the first real home I've had in a long, long time. If you'll have me, I'd like to stay on, for good." The words hung in the air, filled with a weight she couldn't comprehend. The relief that washed over her was so powerful it almost buckled her knees. The thought of him leaving had become an ache in her chest she hadn't wanted to admit. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The work is hard. There's no money." "I've learned that good people and honest work are worth more than money," he said. "Then yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, I'd like you to stay." Later that evening, after the children were in bed, they sat on the porch. The silence between them was no longer filled with suspicion, but with a comfortable, quiet understanding. "Elias," she said softly, "tell me about your past. Tell me what brought you to my door." He was quiet for a long time, staring out at the stars. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy. "I was a soldier, Catherine, in the war." "A soldier." The scars suddenly made sense. "Union Army," he continued. "I had a younger brother, Charlie. He was all I had left in the world. He got sick, consumption. I was with my unit in Georgia when I got the word he was dying." He paused, his jaw tight. "My commanding officer gave me 3 days leave. It wasn't enough time, so I left. I walked away from my post. In the eyes of the army, I'm a deserter. There's a warrant for my arrest." A deserter, a fugitive. The man she had let into her home, into her children's lives, was a wanted man. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Every fear she'd suppressed came roaring back. "Why?" she whispered. "Why didn't you tell me?" He turned to her, his face a mask of anguish. "Would you have let me stay if I had?" The honest answer was no, of course not. But now it was different. She had seen the man he was. She had seen his kindness, his strength. "I got to him just in time," Elias continued, his voice thick with grief. "I was with him for his last month. He didn't die alone." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for her to understand. "I would do it again, Catherine. Warrant or no warrant. I would do it again." She looked at this broken, honorable man, and she saw not a criminal, but a man who had chosen love over duty. A man who had sacrificed everything for his family. It was a choice she understood all too well, but it didn't change the facts. He was a fugitive, and by letting him stay, she was breaking the law. She was putting her children, her farm, everything she had fought for, at risk. Before she could speak, a new, even more terrifying thought struck her, a thought that connected the pieces in a way that made her feel sick. "Elias," she said, her voice trembling, "your commanding officer, the one who wouldn't give you enough leave. What was his name?" Elias looked confused by the question. "It was a long time ago. A captain. His name was Bell, Thomas Bell." The world stopped. It wasn't just that he knew Thomas. It wasn't just that he had served under him. Her husband, her kind, loving Thomas, was the man who had stood in the way of Elias getting to his dying brother. Her Thomas was the reason Elias was a fugitive. The quiet, gentle man she had loved and buried was the villain in Elias Thorne's story. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. The porch seemed to sway beneath her feet. "Thomas?" she whispered, the name a strange and foreign sound in her mouth. "My Thomas?" Elias's face was a canvas of confusion and dawning horror. Your husband was Captain Thomas Bell?" She could only nod, her mind a screaming vortex of disbelief. It couldn't be. The two stories, the two men, couldn't possibly connect in this cruel, twisted way. Thomas was a good man, a kind man. He wrote poetry in his journal. He pressed wildflowers between the pages. He couldn't. "I don't understand," Elias said, his voice ragged. He looked utterly broken, as if the ground had been ripped out from under him. "Captain Bell, he was the finest officer I ever knew. He was brave and he was fair. It never made sense that he would deny my request. It wasn't like him." "Then why?" she choked out. "Why would he do it?" "I don't know," Elias said, shaking his head. "The war, it changed men. I always thought, maybe I caught him on a bad day. Maybe the pressure was too much." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a fresh wave of pain. "Catherine, I never would have come here if I'd known. To show up on the doorstep of the man's wife. But he's the reason," she said, the words sharp and bitter. "He's the reason you're a wanted man. He's the reason you've been on the run for years." A sudden, violent clap of thunder split the night, making them both jump. The sky, which had been clear moments before, was now a roiling mass of dark clouds. Wind whipped through the yard, tearing leaves from the trees. A storm was on them, a storm that had come from nowhere. "The animals!" Catherine cried, her own turmoil forgotten in the face of the immediate threat. They ran for the barn, the wind howling around them, lashing their faces with the first cold drops of rain. Inside, the horses were already panicked, their eyes wide with terror, their whinnies sharp and piercing. The barn door, weakened by years of neglect, was banging violently in the wind. "The door!" Elias shouted over the roar. "We have to secure it!" They threw their combined weight against it, fighting the incredible force of the wind. The latch splintered. They were losing. The door was about to be torn from its hinges. Lightning flashed, illuminating the chaos in a stark white glare. And in that flash, Catherine saw something that didn't make sense. Elias wasn't just pushing, he was talking to the horses, not in the low, soothing tones she'd heard him use before. He was speaking in a low, urgent murmur, using a strange series of words, a phrase, and it was a phrase she knew, a phrase she hadn't heard in 2 years. It was the exact, peculiar phrase Thomas had always used to calm the horses, a silly, nonsensical little rhyme they had made up together one night, a secret between a husband and wife. There was no possible way Elias could know it. The world narrowed to a single roaring point in her head. The storm, the horses, the splintering door, it all faded away. There was only the man beside her, and the impossible words coming from his mouth. "How?" she screamed over the wind. "How do you know that?" Elias looked at her, his face pale in the flickering lantern light. There was no time to explain. With a final desperate heave, they managed to ram a heavy beam of wood against the door, securing it just as a gust of wind tore a section of the roof off the barn. The horses were screaming, rearing up in their stalls. They were going to injure themselves. Or worse. "Stay here!" Elias yelled, and he moved toward the terrified animals. He didn't just soothe them. He placed a hand on Thunder's neck, and the massive animal, which had been wild with fear moments before, instantly became calm. It was not natural. It was like magic. The storm raged outside, but inside the barn, a different kind of storm was breaking in Catherine's mind. The scars, the way he handled a gun she'd seen him cleaning one day, the expert knowledge of farming, of engineering, of medicine. And now this. The secret phrase, the almost supernatural connection with the animals. It all clicked into place. A terrifying, impossible, insane idea. An idea that defied all logic, all reason. After the worst of the storm had passed, they stood in the rain-lashed silence of the barn, the air thick with the smell of wet hay and ozone. "Elias," she said, her voice shaking, "you need to tell me the truth. Not just about the war, about everything." He wouldn't meet her eyes. He just stared at his hands. Those large, capable, scarred hands. "There is no Elias Thorne," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Catherine felt her knees go weak. "What?" "I found him in a field hospital in Virginia. He was a farm boy from Ohio. He died of a fever before he ever saw a battle. His papers? They were my way out. A new name. A new life." "Then who are you?" she demanded, her voice rising. "If you're not Elias Thorne, who are you?" He finally looked at her, and his eyes, those stormy gray eyes she had come to know so well, were filled with a world of pain. "My name," he said, and his voice cracked, "is Charlie. I'm the brother. I'm the one who was supposed to have died." It was the biggest twist yet. The man in front of her wasn't the deserter. He was the dying brother. But how? Consumption. People didn't just recover from that. "But you were sick," she stammered. "Dying." "I was," he said. "But my brother, he wouldn't accept it. He was the one who was good with medicine, with herbs. He nursed me. He brought me back from the brink. But to do it, he had to be away from his post for weeks. He was the one who deserted. He was the one with the warrant." Her mind was spinning. So the story was true, but the brothers were reversed. The man she knew as Elias was actually Charlie, the one who was saved, and her husband's legacy was still stained. "So where is he?" she asked, a new dread coiling in her stomach. "Your brother, the man who was a deserter, Charlie," she had to get used to calling him Charlie, looked at the barn door, at the night outside. He knew the army would come for him eventually. He couldn't live like that, and he couldn't bear the guilt of what he thought he'd done to Captain Bell. He made me promise to come here, to work this land, to repay the debt he felt he owed your husband, to protect you." He took a shaky breath. "He gave me his name, his life, and then he left. He took my name and my sickness and he disappeared into the West, hoping to draw the army's attention away from me." So the man she had come to care for, to trust, was living a lie. A lie built on a bedrock of love and sacrifice, but a lie nonetheless. And just when she thought there could be no more secrets, no more twists, he delivered the final, devastating blow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. She recognized it instantly. She had given it to Thomas on their wedding day. "My brother," Charlie said, his voice thick with unshed tears, "sent me one last letter a month ago. He told me he couldn't run anymore. He told me where he was, and he sent me this." He said Captain Bell had given it to him, for safekeeping. He opened the locket. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph. On one side was a picture of a young Catherine. On the other was not a picture of Thomas. It was a picture of Charlie, the man standing in front of her. Catherine stared at the image, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. That's impossible," she breathed. "I gave this to Thomas." "No," Charlie said softly. "You gave it to the man you thought was Thomas." He looked her straight in the eye, and the final piece of the puzzle slammed into place, shattering her world into a million pieces. "Catherine," he said, "Thomas Bell died in the war. He was killed in an ambush 2 months before I got sick. My brother, the man you married, was Elias Thorne. He took Thomas's name to honor him. He came back from the war a hero, but he was pretending to be a dead man." The farm wasn't her husband's legacy. The children, Samuel and Mary, weren't Thomas Bell's children. They were the children of a man she had never truly known, a man who had lived a lie, who had married her under a false name, and who was now a fugitive, a deserter, hiding somewhere in the vast, empty wilderness of the West. The man in front of her was not her lover. He was her brother-in-law, and he had come here not just to repay a debt, but to protect the family his brother had been forced to abandon. The silence in the barn was a living thing, broken only by the sound of rain drumming on the newly patched roof. Catherine's reality had been detonated. The man she had mourned for 2 years was a ghost she'd never even met. The man she had married, the father of her children, was a stranger named Elias Thorne, a deserter hiding under a dead man's name. And the man standing before her, the man she had been falling in love with, was his brother. "Why?" she finally managed to choke out. "Why would he do that? Why the lie?" Charlie's face was etched with a grief that mirrored her own. Elias loved Thomas. They were closer than brothers. When Thomas died in that ambush, something broke in Elias. He blamed himself. He said Thomas had a family to come home to and he had no one, so he became him. He put on Thomas's identity like a coat. He wrote to you using Thomas's words, Thomas's memories. I think it was the only way he could survive the grief. It was insane. It was the story of a man so shattered by war and loss that he had fractured into someone else. "And you?" she asked, her voice cold. "You knew all along? You came here. You worked his land. You let my children call you Mr. Eli. You knew the whole time?" "Yes," he whispered, the shame heavy in his voice. "Elias made me promise. When he left, a month after the wedding, he made me swear I would watch over you. He knew he couldn't stay. The lie was too heavy, and he was terrified the army would find him and bring shame to you and the children. He loved you, Catherine, so much that he walked away from the only happiness he had ever known, just to keep you safe. The love story she cherished was a lie. Her marriage was a fraud. Her entire life for the past 3 years was built on the grief-stricken obsession of a man she didn't know. So the man I married," she said, the words like ice, "was a coward." "No!" Charlie's voice was sharp, defensive. "He was a hero. Everything he did out of love. Love for Thomas and love for you." "Love?" she spat. "Love doesn't begin with a lie that deep." Before he could answer, the sound of hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Not one horse, many. They were moving fast. Charlie's head snapped up, his body instantly tense. The calm farmer was gone, replaced by the hard-eyed soldier she had glimpsed before. "Get in the house," he ordered, his voice low and urgent. "Lock the doors. Stay away from the windows." "Who is it?" she asked, her heart pounding. "It's not the army," he said grimly. "They wouldn't ride like that." He grabbed an old pitchfork, his eyes scanning the darkness outside the barn door. He was right. This wasn't a military patrol. This was something else, something wild and dangerous. From the relative safety of the kitchen, she peeked through a crack in the curtains. At least a dozen riders were swarming the yard, their figures silhouetted against the stormy sky. They were rough-looking men, heavily armed. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a cruel face, dismounted and strode toward the barn. "Thorn!" the man yelled, his voice like gravel. "I know you're in there. The army told us where to find you, said you were the key to finding your brother." So that was it. They weren't after Charlie, they were after Elias, and they thought Charlie was the bait. "I've got no quarrel with you, Walsh," Charlie's voice boomed from the barn. Walsh, the name from the lawyer's report in the story that was. But this was real. This was the corrupt captain, the man responsible for the ambush that killed the real Thomas Bell, the true villain of the story. "Your brother Elias killed some of my men last month when they tried to take him," Walsh snarled. "He owes me. And you're going to tell me where he is, or I'm going to burn this farm to the ground with the woman and the kids inside." Catherine's blood ran cold. This wasn't about a warrant anymore. This was about revenge. Suddenly, a rifle shot cracked from the hayloft of the barn. One of Walsh's men cried out and fell from his horse. Charlie wasn't just armed with a pitchfork. He had a rifle, and he knew how to use it. The yard erupted into chaos. Gunfire exploded from all directions, the night lit up by muzzle flashes. The house was being peppered with bullets, wood splintering, windows shattering. Catherine grabbed the children who were screaming with terror and shoved them under the heavy oak table. "Stay down!" she screamed. "Don't move!" She looked around frantically. Her home was a war zone, and Charlie was out there, alone, fighting a dozen men. He was going to die. Then her eyes landed on the wall above the fireplace. Hanging there was Thomas's old hunting rifle, the real Thomas's rifle. She hadn't touched it in years, but she knew how to use it. Thomas had taught her. The real Thomas, in the letters he wrote before Elias had stolen his life. Her hands were shaking as she took it down. She found the box of cartridges in the study. Her mind was a whirlwind of terror and rage. These men were trying to destroy her family, her home. They were trying to kill the man who, despite all the lies, had shown her nothing but kindness. Another volley of shots slammed into the house. She had to do something. She crawled to the back window, the one that looked out over the barn. She could see Charlie, using a water trough for cover, firing methodically into the darkness. He was a good shot. 2 more of Walsh's men were down, but he was outnumbered. Walsh was creeping up on the side of the barn, using the shadows for cover. He had a pistol in his hand. He was going to shoot Charlie in the back. Catherine rested the rifle on the windowsill. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She took a deep breath, just like Thomas had taught her. She let it out slowly. She lined up the sights on Walsh's dark figure, and she pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. The roar was deafening in the small kitchen. Outside, Walsh cried out in pain and surprise, clutching his arm. The pistol fell from his grasp. He spun around, his face contorted with rage, staring directly at the house. He had seen her. Charlie took the opportunity. He vaulted over the trough, closing the distance between them in a few long strides. The fight was brutal and fast. It wasn't a farmhand's brawl. It was the desperate, deadly struggle of 2 trained soldiers. Just as it seemed Charlie was getting the upper hand, one of Walsh's remaining men charged from the darkness, tackling him from behind. Charlie went down hard. Walsh was on him in an instant, his knife flashing in the moonlight. Catherine screamed. It was over. He was going to die. Suddenly, another gunshot echoed through the night, but this one came from the road, and then another, and another. A new group of riders was charging into the yard, their rifles blazing. At their head was Henrik Larsson. "Catherine!" he yelled. "Are you all right?" He and a half-dozen other local farmers had heard the gunfire and had come running, armed and ready to defend their neighbor. Walsh's men, caught completely by surprise, broke and ran, melting back into the darkness from which they came. Walsh, seeing his men flee and with Henrik's riders bearing down on him, scrambled to his feet. He looked at Catherine, who still had the rifle trained on him from the window, and his face was a mask of pure hatred. Then he looked at Charlie, who was struggling to his feet. "This isn't over, Thorn!" he spat, and then he too disappeared into the night. The sudden silence was more shocking than the noise. The yard was littered with wounded men, and the smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Henrik and his men were securing the area, tending to the injured. Catherine ran from the house, her bare feet flying across the muddy ground toward the barn. Charlie was leaning against the wall, breathing heavily. He had a deep gash on his forehead, and his shirt was torn, but he was alive. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling. He just looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a raw, powerful emotion she had never seen before. "You saved my life," he said. "You saved ours," she replied. They stood there in the wreckage of the battle, the lies and secrets between them seeming small and insignificant in the face of what they had just survived. They had fought for this place, together. Just then, Samuel and Mary came running from the house, their faces streaked with tears. They threw their arms around Charlie's legs, sobbing with relief. "Mr. Eli, you're safe!" Mary cried. He knelt, wincing in pain, and pulled them into a fierce hug. He looked up at Catherine over their small heads, and in that moment, she didn't see a stranger or a brother-in-law. She saw a man who would die to protect her children. She knew then that the old story of her life was over. The story of Catherine Bell, the grieving widow, the story of Thomas Bell, the perfect husband, the story of Elias Thorne, the mysterious drifter. All of it had been burned away in the fire of this one violent night. This was the beginning of a new story, a story that was more complicated, more painful, and more real than anything she had ever known. A story she would have to write herself, one day at a time. And as she looked at Charlie, holding her children, the truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had fallen in love with a ghost, but she was standing in front of a man, and she knew, with a certainty that shook her to her very core, that she would do anything to keep him. The sun rose on a scene of devastation. The yard was scarred with hoof prints and bloodstains. The house and barn were riddled with bullet holes, but the farm was still standing, and they were all alive. The local sheriff arrived with the dawn, a weary man who looked overwhelmed by the night's events. He took statements, arrested the wounded men from Walsh's gang that Henrik's posse had rounded up, and listened with wide-eyed disbelief to the story of deserters, corrupt captains, and mistaken identities. "So this man," the sheriff said, pointing a thumb at Charlie, who was getting his forehead stitched up by a grim-faced Dr. Hartwell, "isn't the deserter the army is looking for. His brother is." "That's right," Catherine said, her voice steady. She had made a decision during the long, dark hours before dawn. The lies were over. From now on, there would only be the truth, no matter how messy. "And this Walsh fella is the real villain," the sheriff mused, scratching his head. "Sounds like a mess for the army to sort out." "It is," a new voice said. Everyone turned. A man in a crisp, clean suit was stepping out of a buggy that had just pulled into the yard. He looked completely out of place in the rustic chaos. "James Patterson," he announced, extending a hand to the sheriff. "I'm a lawyer from Denver. I represent the Thorne family." He explained that he had been hired by Elias weeks ago, after Elias had sent the locket to Charlie. Elias knew Walsh would eventually come looking for him, and he wanted to make sure Catherine and the children were legally protected. He wanted to clear his name. "Elias Thorne isn't a deserter," Patterson explained, his voice crisp and professional. "He was acting under a direct, albeit secret, order from General Sheridan himself. He was sent undercover to expose Captain Walsh's corruption. The desertion was his cover story." Another twist. Another layer of the story peeled back. Elias wasn't a coward hiding from his past. He was an undercover agent, A hero working in the shadows. We have testimony. We have documents, Patterson continued. Elias Thorne will be fully exonerated. In fact, he's likely to receive a commendation for his bravery. He then turned to Catherine, his expression softening. He also wanted me to deliver this. He handed her a thick envelope. Inside was a letter and a stack of legal documents. The documents were a deed. Elias had used his back pay from the army to purchase the farm from the bank. He had signed it over, free and clear, to her. Catherine Bell. Her hands shook as she read the letter. The handwriting was the same as in Thomas's journal, the handwriting of the man she had married. My dearest Catherine, it began. If you are reading this, it means the worst has happened, and Walsh has found his way to you. I can only pray that you and the children are safe, and that my brother was there to protect you, as he promised. There are no words to express my regret for the lies. I was a man lost in grief, and I dishonored the memory of a good man by stealing his name. My only excuse is that in becoming him, I found you. And loving you, even for a short time, was the only true and real thing in my life. I have tried to make amends. The farm is yours. It was always yours. The life I built with you was a dream, and now I must wake up and face the consequences. Walsh is a symptom of a sickness that has run deep since the war. It is my duty to root it out. I am going after him, and I will not stop until he and his entire network are brought to justice. Do not mourn me. Live a good life. Be happy. Let Charlie help you. He is a better man than I am. You were the best part of my stolen life. For that, I will love you forever. Yours, Elias. Tears streamed down her face as she read the words. It was a confession, a love letter, and a goodbye. Over the next few weeks, the farm slowly returned to normal, but it was a new kind of normal. A federal marshal was now stationed in town, and posses were scouring the territory for any sign of Walsh or Elias. The story had become a legend in the territory. The widow farmer, the two brothers, the epic shootout. Henrik Larsson became a different man. Humbled and ashamed, he organized the neighbors to help rebuild Catherine's barn and repair the house. He never spoke of marriage again, but he became a true friend, a reliable neighbor who treated Charlie with a newfound respect. And Charlie, he stayed. He worked the land with a quiet determination, his grief a silent shadow that followed him everywhere. He and Catherine rarely spoke of Elias. The name was like an open wound, too painful to touch. But a new bond was forming between them, forged in the heat of battle and cemented in the shared responsibility of raising the children. The children, in their innocence, adapted easily. They knew the man they called Papa was gone, and the man they called Mr. Eli was here to stay. That was enough for them. One cool evening in late autumn, Catherine found Charlie on the porch, staring out at the harvest-ready fields. "It's a good crop," she said softly, sitting in the chair beside him. "He would be proud," Charlie replied. They sat in silence for a long time. "Have you heard anything?" she finally asked. He shook his head. "Patterson says the army is closing in on Walsh's network. They've arrested dozens of men. But of Walsh, or Elias, nothing." She knew what he wasn't saying. Elias was either deep under cover or he was dead. "Charlie," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "what are we going to do?" He turned to her, and his stormy eyes were filled with an emotion she was finally brave enough to name. It was love, a quiet, patient, steady love. "We're going to raise these children," he said, his voice firm. "We're going to run this farm. We're going to build a life, right here, together." "But the lies," she started. "Your brother—" "My brother is a hero who gave me a second chance at life," Charlie said, his voice thick. "And you are the woman who saved that life. The lies are in the past, Catherine. We are what's real." He reached out and took her hand. His touch was warm and strong. It felt like coming home. "Is that what you want?" he asked, his voice filled with a vulnerability that mirrored her own. She looked at this man, this good, strong, honorable man who had come into her life as a stranger and had become its anchor. He was not the ghost she had mourned. He was not the husband she had married. He was something more. He was her partner. "Yes," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, that's what I want." The future was a blank page. The story of Elias Thorne, the hero in the shadows, might never have an ending. But as the first stars began to appear in the vast Wyoming sky, Catherine knew her story was just beginning. She had found love not once but twice. Once in a beautiful dream, and once in a harsh, complicated, and magnificent reality. And she knew, with every fiber of her being, that the love she and Charlie would build together would be strong enough to withstand any storm. It was a love forged in loss, tested by fire, and built on the hard-won ground of truth. The greatest loves aren't the ones that are perfect. They're the ones we fight for, the ones we choose again and again every single day. If you believe in the power of second chances and the strength it takes to build a new life from the ashes of the old, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. Because these are the stories that remind us that even after the deepest loss, the sun will eventually rise again. And you won't want to miss the story we have for you next.